Professor Chomsky really needs no introduction here. An internationally renowned scholar, activist, and man of conscience, he has been called the most important intellectual alive. Well, while we are all aware of Professor Chomsky's accomplishments, one important thing to remember is that he was one of the first influential people in this country to take up the Timorese cause. In the absence of media coverage, he has played a crucial role in raising international awareness of the situation in East Timor. Indeed, the only reason many of us in this room have even heard of East Timor is because Professor Chomsky has been writing and lecturing about it for well over a decade. We are fortunate that he has volunteered his time to be with us tonight. Please welcome Institute Professor of Linguistics, Noam Chomsky.
Because of the ethics code at MIT, he didn't mention some of the other things I've been called, but we'll forget about that. The topic for tonight was going to be lessons of the Timor tragedy. The main lesson, for us at least, and the hardest one, is pretty straightforward and simple, I think. The main lesson is that it can, if we are willing to let it, help us gain the capacity to look honestly in the mirror, to learn about ourselves, and I don't mean ourselves individually, but rather socially. That is, to learn about our institutions and our society and our culture and how they function and what they mean, not only for East Timor, but given who we are, for a very substantial part of the world. In fact, by now, virtually all of it. Well, that's a lesson that there are many, that's a hard one to acquire, for one reason, because there's a vast array of techniques for avoiding it. And in fact, to avoid it is quite important. In fact, avoiding the lesson of being able to look in the mirror is virtually a precondition for access to respectability and prestige. Of the many ways of avoiding that lesson, perhaps the most efficient is to focus very narrowly. To focus narrowly in time and in place. So you take a look at one case or some narrow time frame, and you look at that. And as long as you look at some narrow time frame, whatever you discover, how awful it is, it basically teaches you nothing, because it could be by accident or inadvertence or oversight or whatever. Lots of excuses. So for example, right now there's a big discussion going on, as you're all aware, as to how we should design a post-Cold War foreign policy. What are the guidelines? So and the framing of the discussion is, how can we enlarge our commitment to market democracy, and how can we learn better how to carry out humanitarian intervention? The discussion keeps very strictly to the post-Cold War period. In fact, if you look, it keeps very strictly to the last few weeks, usually. And that makes a lot of sense. Because if you keep it focused very narrowly, then it's unnecessary to ask the obvious question that would occur to a rational person, and that is what our record has been with regard to markets and democracy and human rights. And that's a useful move, since if you face those questions, the discussion about enlarging our commitment to market democracy or learning better how to carry out humanitarian intervention can't even be raised. And you furthermore learn that the reasons for this have absolutely nothing to do with the Cold War. And exactly the same is true with regard to place. So tonight we're meeting on East Timor, and tomorrow it might be on Somalia, and the next day on the Israel-Arafat Accord, and then on Haiti. And we have specialists who study particular regions out there and tell us all about them. And they're the ones that you go to if there's a problem somewhere. The problems that are all externalized. There are things that happen in that strange world out there that we somehow are caught up in against our will and don't quite understand them and so on. And we therefore carry out policies out of ignorance or inadvertence. The media don't report it very accurately. Like, for example, they didn't report the US-backed atrocities in East Timor because of carelessness or oversight, because the newsroom is a busy place. I've read lots and lots of this commentary on this in the US media, and I have yet to find one person who says there's something systematic that happened here. It's taken for granted that what happened was just, well, you know, things of that kind. And so that's not true media coverage abroad of how the US media handled this thing. They're quite willing to say US media are terrible, but that's because it's the US media. When you ask about their media, then the same set of responses comes along. Again, a narrow focus has many merits. I don't want to discredit it. It means that we can avoid the discovery of the fact that the policies that the U.S. government follows and the planning that lies behind them is highly systematic. U.S. is a global power, therefore we find very much the same policies, same things guiding them all over the world. We find that human rights are not violated just in East Timor, but that U.S. aid correlates very closely with torture, for example. It's been demonstrated over and over again. We find that the doctrinal institutions, not just the media, but the intellectual culture generally, focus on what my co-author Edward Herman has sometimes called worthy victims, namely those whose suffering is utilitarian for career and power interests. That is, you can exploit their suffering to support domestic power and hence advance your own interests. They're worthy victims because some enemy is doing something to them, and if it's not bad enough, you can make up stories. On the other hand, you keep away from unworthy victims, those who are being tortured or slaughtered either by us or by our agents, since plainly no career or power interest is served by focusing attention on unworthy victims. You don't do it. Note that that's exactly the opposite of the behavior of any person of minimal moral integrity, but it is entirely systematic. In fact, it's a feature, almost a defining feature of the intellectual culture, not just the media. This is not a new discovery, I should say. About 150 years ago, when the system of compulsory education was being introduced in an effort to convert independent farmers into diligent and obedient factory workers. One of the illiterate critics of this system remarked that them as reads newspapers knows too much about other folks' sins and not enough about their own, which is a fair summary of what thousands of pages of documentation and analysis and footnotes and so on have demonstrated over the years. Well, if you keep your focus very narrow in time and place, you can avoid looking at unpleasant questions about how we do things and why we do them. And you can assume that policy flows from generalized benevolence or the search for security or what the New York Times calls our yearning for democracy, and it grows out of a plural consensus, all of these cliches of the intellectual culture that you're familiar with. You can also conclude that the doctrinal systems, sometimes careless, they're accidental omissions, and so on and so forth. Now, looking at Timor, we can fall into the same pattern, and I think we should not. If we focus narrowly, we will, in fact, discover a very ugly story, one of dedicated U.S. support for near genocidal slaughter and radical opposition to democracy. We will also discover that reporting declined from a rather high level in 1974, right before the invasion, 1974-75. It declined as the slaughter increased in parallel, declined to zero at the peak of the slaughter in 1978. Same was true of Canada, another major supporter of Indonesia. And we find similar carelessness until today. It's going on right now with regard to absolutely crucial issues, which I'll talk about. Well, maybe that's somehow just a strange accident. These self-serving conclusions are very quickly refuted if instead of narrowing our time and place focus, we look at what happened in East Timor in somewhat greater historical depth with regard to Indonesia and Southeast Asia altogether. And if we look at other cases that were going on, let's say in exactly those same years. The U.S. being a global power, there are a great many examples to choose. Let me just pick one out of the many. It's maybe the most obvious one. There happened to be another country where a large slaughter, not quite as large, but rather impressive, was going on in the very same years, late 1970s, peaking, actually it peaked in 78, 79, right at the same time that the Timorese one did. It wasn't quite as high. Instead of 200,000 people, it was only maybe 40,000 or 50,000, although in the following years it doubled to maybe 70 or 80,000. I'm talking about Nicaragua. The slaughter in Nicaragua was going on at the same time that the slaughter in Timor was. There are many other similarities, both under the Carter administration, the Human Rights Administration, so we really learn a lot about ourselves because we can see what was going on at the period when we were, just absolutely dedicated to human rights. It was the soul of our foreign policy and so on, all picked up and continued in the Reagan years and continuing until this day in both countries, I should say. Nicaragua has another advantage for me personally. I just returned from there around midnight last night, so some of these scenes of our atrocities are rather fresh in my mind. There are some interesting similarities, and let me say a word or two about them. One striking lesson of Timor, is that in our political and intellectual culture, human rights have a purely instrumental value. That is, human rights are important if you can gain something by focusing on them. If you can gain some power or wealth or prestige or whatever. Otherwise, they're of no value whatsoever. That was very dramatic during the years of the worst slaughter in Timor, the worst slaughter, late 1970s. The reason it was very dramatic at the time was because of the comparison, which was brought out a number of times, by me in particular, between what was going on in East Timor and what was going on in Cambodia under Pol Pot. Same years, same place, same area of the world. Same scale, relative to the population, considerably higher in East Timor, I should say. An absolute scale, pretty much the same, about 1977, 1978, when the peak was. Numbers aren't certain, but they're in the same range, and as I say, considerably higher relative to the population in East Timor. There's one fundamental difference, however. In Cambodia, they were worthy victims. They were being killed by some enemy. And you could gain something personal and for power interests by focusing attention on them. In Timor, they were unworthy victims. We were killing them. It's true the Indonesians were pulling the trigger, but it was our trigger. And the Carter administration was giving them military aid and diplomatic support with the certain knowledge that this was going on. And in fact, when Indonesian arms actually, amazingly, the Indonesian army, which is quite substantial, was its arms were declining because of it was running into a shortage of arms in 1978 because of the attack. The Carter administration rushed additional arms to them to make sure that the attack could really reach near genocidal proportions. So they were unworthy victims. And if you look at the knowledge of the two cases, Pol Pot, Cambodia, the symbol of worst thing since Hitler, if not worse, Indonesia and East Timor unknown, coverage in the United States going down to flat zero by 1978 when this was going on. Coverage of Pol Pot atrocities, a huge booming industry, people running to the border to agonize and so on and so forth. It's a pretty dramatic contrast. Of course, it's a contrast, the lessons of which can never be drawn in the United States. So the contrast is evident, clear, child could understand it, but it's unknown. It's not part of the intellectual culture or the political culture, which is immune from self-recognition. That's a very crucial part of it. Well, the Timor-Nicaragua a comparison also brings out such examples. So, for example, nothing was more inspiring than the passion that was felt by Americans for the fate of the Mosquito Indians in Sandinista, Nicaragua, back about 7 or 8 years ago when a couple of dozen of them were killed. And in fact, they were rather quite harshly treated by the Sandinistas, although the treatment of the Mosquito Indians was rather saintly by comparison to those who we were supporting. Treatment of indigenous peoples by people we were enthusiastically supporting who weren't killing a couple of dozen of them, but slaughtering tens of thousands of them and in Guatemala and El Salvador. comparison, which was made but left unknown. However, let's look at today. Today, about 100,000 people are starving in the Atlantic coast, and starving to death, literally starving, in the Atlantic coast in Nicaragua, most of them Mosquito Indians, after a major tropical storm which wiped out whatever development had taken place. It's reported by evangelical Christian organizations that work there, who also report that they're receiving aid from churches in Europe or from a Canadian ship. Somehow, something happened to our great love of the Mosquito Indians. What's the reason? Well, the usual reason, which is absolutely systematic worldwide. 10 years ago, they were worthy victims. People who we were attacking and trying to destroy were repressing them, so they were worthy victims. But now they're unworthy victims. They're starving and dying because of what we have done to that country. Therefore, the love of Mosquito Indians has disappeared, and you don't read anything about them, and I doubt that one word has been written in the United States about the, except in, little church papers here and there, about the fact that 100,000 are starving to death right now, like not last month, but now, in the Atlantic coast, where all great humanitarians had devoted their attention a few years ago when they were worthy victims. Well, that's normal. Second point of comparison, which is relevant, has to do with terror. In the late 70s, the Guard, the National Guard, which we had established to rule Nicaragua, was the Somoza regime, the Somoza dictatorship, which had virtually destroyed the country, was collapsing. The National Guard went crazy, and in the last Carter years, 78, 79, slaughtered about, nobody knows exactly, but maybe 40 or 50,000 people. The Carter administration was represented in Nicaragua by Lawrence Pizzullo, now considered a great liberal hero. We now have the secret cables that have been released between him and the White House, and he recommended that the slaughter continue, that the U.S. not try to stop the bombardment, which was murdering tens of thousands of people, but that it continue because it was extremely important to keep the Sandinista revolution from winning. When Somoza couldn't be sustained anymore, the Carter administration got rid of him, but tried to keep the Guard in until the last minute to try to make sure that they would run the country. When even the Guard couldn't be kept because they were collapsing under a popular assault, the Carter administration flew the leadership out of the country in planes marked with Red Cross markings, which happens to be a war crime if anybody cares, small in comparison with the others, and set them up on the Honduran border. At that time, using Argentine neo-Nazis as trainers. Then the Reagan administration took it over themselves, and the slaughter went on for the next 10 years in a manner that you're familiar with, maybe doubling the number of people killed and pretty much destroying the country. Well, it's not quite the scale of the Timorese atrocities, but strikingly similar. A third element, well, this one's not quite as similar, but there are comparisons, has to do with economic warfare. Economic warfare is crucially going on in Timor. The form that it's taking is robbery of resources. Timor has resources. It's not a rich country, but it has coffee, which is stolen by the Indonesian army, meaning our agents, in order to run the costs of the administration. And crucially, it has oil. Or it's expected, it's assumed it has quite a lot of oil offshore in the Timor Gap between Australia and Indonesia. Even before the invasion in 1975, Australia was negotiating with Indonesia, not with Timor, to take over, to exploit the oil, Timorese oil, and now it's going on with the active participation of the major oil companies. I'll come back to that. That's economic warfare in Timor. In Nicaragua, it takes a different form, actually a much more lethal form, and it's continuing. The IMF, which is our agency, gave its latest orders to Nicaragua just a few days ago, in fact. The orders are that it must immediately reduce its debt to zero immediately. You can imagine what would happen if the United States had to follow those orders. It has to cut back $60 million from social expenses, health and so on, which will reduce them essentially to zero. It has to eliminate any credits from the National Bank, meaning credits to poor farmers to let them plant seeds and so on. Has to furthermore privatize the banks, has to privatize everything else, like, for example, water, so that if people can't afford it, they just, die of, they don't get water and so on. The banking system has in fact been partially privatized already. That has contributed to the export of $60 million of very scarce Nicaraguan capital just in the last year by symbolic accident. That's the same amount as as Nicaragua must now cut down from its by now virtually non-existent health and welfare expenditures. There's a reason for that. And I'll come back to it in a moment, but let's notice the consequences. $60 million in capital exported by the privatized banks means no credit to bean farmers, for example. So therefore they didn't plant, and therefore Nicaragua has lost its bean crop. Well, beans are the staple for poor people, which means there will be rising and increasing starvation as a result of liberalization. And there's good reasons for this. Any of you who've studied economics at a good place like MIT understand them and can even prove a theorem. And in fact, if you're really clever, you can generalize it to 10-dimensional space and get a good job and that sort of business. The theorem is that, liberalization yields a more efficient use of resources. And you can prove it, in fact, and it's really true. It's a more efficient use of resources by the economist's measure to send $60 million for speculation in the New York stock market than to give it to poor bean farmers who will produce beans to feed the population. It maximizes general resources most efficiently to do things that way, so therefore that's what you do if you really believe in the free market, as we do for others, not for ourselves, of course. Meanwhile, this is only well, I won't. It's late, and I see Jose is here, so I won't go on with the rest of this story. But I'll just tell you what the consequences are. There are thousands, or probably tens of thousands, of children starving right in the streets of Managua, not only in the countryside where it's much worse. You see them all the time. You drive through the streets, and if you stop at a traffic light, your car, there's swarms of kids come around your car, washing the windows or trying to do something, so maybe you'll give them a few pennies. If you come by in the evening, you see the same kids. They're now given up trying to beg or sell, but to sell or do some so-called service, so they're just pressing their faces against the windows, pleading for a couple of pennies so maybe they can eat something before they go to sleep in the streets. We have given them the benefits of a free market, so they have alternatives, because that's what free market's all about. The main alternative is they can sniff glue, which takes away the hunger, and that too contributes to efficient use of resources because we can export it, and we do. It's one of our big exports to Nicaragua is glue for making shoes, and way in excess of the number of shoes that are used, it is apparently quite good for relieving hunger, so you sniff glue. So that's more efficient use of resources, and in fact, again, any good economist can prove that this is really the best of all possible worlds we're moving towards, so we're doing just the right thing. In fact, Nicaragua is just barely above, it's going to challenge Haiti pretty soon for poorest country in the hemisphere. It's very close. Infant mortality, which was going way down, has now been shooting high up. We can be very pleased about that. It's not quite the same as Haiti because the security forces in Nicaragua aren't yet under U.S. control. And it's been a major U.S. policy imperative, particularly emphasized during the Kennedy administration, that the security forces in every Western Hemisphere country must be under U.S. control. Doesn't matter much what else happens, but we got to run the security forces. And that hasn't happened yet in Nicaragua. The Marines succeeded in creating a national guard in Haiti during the 20-year occupation they had. So that's one difference between Haiti and Nicaragua. There's plenty of violence as the social system collapses, but there isn't the massive, organized, structured violence that you get from well-trained security forces, the kind you have in Haiti. Otherwise, they're getting pretty close. Well, it's not exactly like Timor. There are different reasons for why we're torturing Nicaragua and why we're torturing Timor. The special reasons in the case of Timor and Nicaragua, they stood up to the Godfather, and that's a crime. Everyone's got to learn that you don't do that. You have to suffer, and you have to suffer cruelly. It's not reported here because it's not a useful lesson for us, but it's well understood in the third world. You don't stand up to the Godfather. If you do, you'll be ground to dust, and it'll never end. You'll be crushed to dust, and there won't be any reporting, and the intellectual culture will accept it. That's the way the world is supposed to work, and you better learn it. In Timor, the motives are for our quite profound commitment to torture and terror, and in this case, something like genocide, are a bit different, and let me turn briefly to that. But here with some history, because I think Jose Ramos Horta will fill in more of the details about Timor itself, I presume. That's what I'll talk about. The background for our involvement in Timor, the United States has actually no interest whatsoever in Timor. It could disappear off the face of the map and U.S. planners wouldn't notice it. But they care a lot about Indonesia. And they've cared about Indonesia for a long time because it's a country that's extremely rich in resources and means plenty of ways to make a lot of money and profit from it. In post-war planning, the early post-war planning in 1945, Indonesia had a major role in the general context of Southeast Asia and in the still more general context of global planning. The highest priority of the United States around 1945 was to reconstruct the industrial societies, especially Japan and Germany, considered the natural leaders. And that was extremely important because the U.S. had a big surplus of manufactured exports and a big surplus of capital and nothing to do with it, and it was obvious that they both had to go primarily to the industrial societies, so they had to be rebuilt. The third world had to contribute to this, namely by effectively restoring colonial relations, and this was all quite explicit. Well thought out, sophisticated reasoning, quite detailed and explicit. In fact, all the documents are now out. Every part of the third world had its function within this system. Southeast Asia, as George Kennan's state policy planning group in the State Department put it, was to fulfill its major function, its main function, as a source of resources and raw materials for Japan and Western Europe. That was the function of Southeast Asia, and it wasn't nothing like nationalism or anything was supposed to get in the way. Now, Indonesia had a key role in this. Indonesia was going to be a crucial part of what Kennan called Japan's empire toward the south, that we were going to be reconstructing for them. Now, Japan had tried to construct an empire toward the south alone, and that led to the Second World War. But now we were going to reconstruct it for them, but we were going to control it. So that was going to be okay. They could continue doing what they'd done before, but now under our general control, and Kennan and others made it clear in planning that we were going to take charge. They were not going to get away from us this time. So that empire toward the south was going to be reconstructed, and Indonesia was a central part of it. Its riches would then be useful for the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, and the very closely linked concern, in fact driving concern, of profits and vast expansion for U.S. industry that in fact led to the growth of the transnational economy. In 1948, Kennan, who was one of the chief post-war planners, as you know, described the problem of Indonesia as the most crucial issue in the world at the moment, in our struggle with the Kremlin. Struggle with the Kremlin as a code word, which means our attack against independent nationalist forces anywhere in the world that might have some other idea other than the service function. A communist Indonesia, he said, would be an infection that would sweep over all of South Asia. Communist is another code word. It means anybody who doesn't follow orders, so like a priest in Central America or something. So we got to stop that infection. Timor was also mentioned, curiously, by a little earlier. In fact, one of President Roosevelt's leading foreign policy advisors, Sumner Welles, also in world planning, said that he thought that, so a side comment, that Timor deserved independence, though he thought they ought to have to wait a bit. He said it will certainly take 1,000 years. But somewhere down the road, we'll get to them. Indonesia, in contrast, got independence, mainly because the U.S. wanted to break up the traditional imperial systems. It's not Holland that runs that part of the world, we run it. So therefore, they get nominal independence. But it had to be under Dutch tutelage, meaning that you had to preserve the same colonial relations, but now with formal independence because of the role of Indonesia and Southeast Asia and their main function and so on, which I've just mentioned. There's a technical name for this too. It's called Wilsonian idealism. And in fact, that's accurate because that's exactly what Wilson had in mind. I mean, we're all taught about the wonderful commitment to self-determination, but if you read Wilson's 14 points, you find something different, namely that self-determination is not for what he called people at a low stage of civilization, meaning the whole third world as we call it now. Those people, he said, need the protection and guidance of the colonial powers that have cared so solicitously for their interests over the preceding years. And furthermore, Wilson emphasized the rights of the colonial powers have equal weight with those of the populations concerned in the colonial areas. That's what's known as Wilsonian idealism, and it was applied in Indonesia by the condition that they remain under Dutch tutelage, meaning sort of playing their role with regard to Japan and Western Europe, aiding their reconstruction. There was a conflict in Indonesia between two major forces. One was the one mass political party, the PKI, the Communist Party, mostly peasants, and the other was the army, which accepted U.S. aims and was therefore known as moderate, which is another code word for doing what the U.S. says. The president, Sukarno, the nationalist hero, kind of ran a balancing act between these two forces. In 1957 and 58, the CIA backed a coup attempt to try to throw him out. It failed. They then turned under the Kennedy administration to the classic system for overthrowing a civilian government. The way you overthrow a civilian government is you provide arms to the military and you cut back support to the civilian sector. That's essentially what happened during the Iran-Contra scandal, if you want to know the truth of the matter. But it's absolutely, and in fact, Indonesia was a model, but that's standard. So that went on in the early 60s under Kennedy. The idea is to get rid of Sukarno's nationalism, which was considered a real irritant, meaning some military coup has to come along. One leading Indonesia specialist, Southeast Asia specialist, Professor William Kintner at the University of Pennsylvania, a research institute, wrote at that time, 1963, that with Western help, free Asian political leaders, together with the military, must liquidate the enemy's political and guerrilla armies. That's the goal we were after. We got to liquidate their political armies, meaning political party there. The Rand Corporation's leading specialist on Indonesia, Guy Pauker, urged his contacts in the Indonesian military to strike and sweep the house clean. But he was worried that they weren't going to do it. He said that they probably lacked the ruthlessness and discipline that made it possible for the Nazis to suppress the communists in Germany. However, it turned out that our pessimism on that score was unfounded. In October 30th, 1965, General Suharto took over in a coup after the assassination of several generals under circumstances which are still rather obscure. That led to a huge bloodbath in which maybe nobody knows how many, 500,000, million people, mostly landless peasants, were slaughtered in the next few months, 4 months. And that was noticed in the United States. Pauker, for example, recognized right away that his pessimism had been unfounded. The assassination of the generals, he said, elicited the ruthlessness that I had not anticipated and led to the death of a large number of communist cadres, meaning maybe 750,000 landless peasants. The U.S. supported the massacre, provided aid, though it did provide aid only with hesitation. The hesitation was that if the aid was too overt, it might play into the hands of Sukarno, who we're trying to get rid of, and who was in fact soon eliminated. The slaughter was the greatest since the Holocaust, and it elicited euphoria in the West. Not mild applause, but complete euphoria. I've reviewed the U.S. coverage quite extensively in print, if you're interested. Defense Secretary McNamara, testifying before Congress, was asked whether U.S. aid to the Indonesian military before the coup had been a worthwhile expense, and he said yes, it had paid dividends. At the time he spoke, about 500,000 or more dividends were already being accumulated. In a special letter to the President, Defense Secretary McNamara pointed specifically to the training. Somebody asked about training of Indonesian officers. He pointed specifically to the training that we had provided to the Indonesian officers, especially when we brought them to the United States, to universities. And he said that their training in the universities was particularly valuable in giving them the right orientation, as had just been demonstrated. Freedom House published a big ad signed by over 100 distinguished Americans explaining that the slaughter, that what they called the dramatic changes in Indonesia, meaning this mass slaughter, demonstrated that we were right to be in Vietnam. That justified the war in Vietnam because our presence in Vietnam, they said, had provided, this was liberal Americans, I should say, had provided a shield behind which the Indonesian generals were encouraged to carry out the necessary task of cleansing their society. Years later, McGeorge Bundy, who had been Kennedy's national security advisor, then Johnson's, wrote that the big mistake we made in Vietnam was not getting out after the Indonesian slaughter. The main purpose of our being in Vietnam was to make sure that the threat of independent development didn't spread and incite others to pursue the same course. But once Indonesia was secured, that was the main one that we cared about, and it was by late 1965, after the mass slaughter and destruction of the only popular organization. As Bundy later realized, it was kind of a waste of time and money to keep our involvement in Vietnam. We could let it just sort of sink into the drain at that point. That was retrospective. Going back to 1965, Time magazine had a big, I think a 10 or 11 page coverage of what they called the West's best news in years. The heading was "Vengeance with a Smile." They described a boiling bloodbath that took 400,000 lives. Very upbeat and cheerful. These are the way it was looked. That's the way it was looked universally, in fact. James Reston, who was the leading liberal commentator in the New York Times, had a column called "Gleam of Light in Asia." And in it, he said that the U.S. role in the coup and the aftermath had been understated. He knew as an insider that the U.S. role was really much greater, and that without U.S. aid, and in particular without the U.S. war in Vietnam, the Suharto coup couldn't have taken place, and the generals were unlikely to have been able to carry out this wonderful achievement. The New York Times editorials over the years were full of, right away and continuing, were full of praise for what they called the Indonesian moderates, who had carried out what they called staggering mass slaughter. However, they did mention that the staggering mass slaughter carried out by the moderates does raise critical questions for Washington. But those questions, fortunately, had been answered correctly, quoting from editorials. Namely, Washington did not embrace the new leaders too effusively, which could have hurt them, though we gave them generous aid secretly so as to make sure that they could continue with the staggering mass slaughter. These are the moderates. There are other questions that might come to mind, but they were not raised in the West. British and Australian coverage, as far as I know, was similar. I haven't covered it systematically. Within about 10 years, the whole story had been critified to the extent that there had actually been a role reversal. It was now the communists who carried out the slaughter. So one of the leading Southeast Asian correspondents, George MacArthur, had a column in the Los Angeles Times in which he said that the PKI had subjected Indonesia to a bloodbath, meaning that they had placed their necks under the knives in a major communist atrocity. That inversion is pretty standard also. And that continues right up to the present. So the last couple of years you can read, say, in the Christian Science Monitor, that after his 1965 achievement, many in the West were keen to cultivate Jakarta's new moderate leader, Suharto. That is the guy who orchestrated the staggering mass slaughter, the boiling bloodbath. The London Economist described Suharto as at heart benign. It said, of course, there are propagandists who talk about the Army's savagery in East Timor and that sort of thing, but they're just propagandists. They're quite different from human rights activists because they're focusing on the wrong victims. It's the usual thing. All of this, I won't go on, sheds quite an interesting light on what's called Western civilization. One actually has to read the originals to appreciate it. It's hard to find a counterpart to this exaltation in mass slaughter, which was virtually universal. There wasn't a voice raised in Congress to criticize it. Not one aid agency suggested going in to help the victims at the time when the headlines were praising the boiling bloodbath that was going on. Well, that's all the background for the U.S. reaction to the East Timor invasion. In 1974-75, as I mentioned, coverage of Timor was quite high, remarkably. The context was the collapse of the Portuguese Empire. There was concern that the collapse of the Portuguese Empire might mean that sectors of the Third World might no longer be playing their service role. They might seek independence. And that caused a lot of concern, so there was a lot of coverage of East Timor. As the Indonesians invaded, the coverage, as I mentioned, began to drop and hit zero when the atrocities mounted to their peak. The U.S., Britain, and Australia, we now know from leaked secret documents that the British, the U.S., and Australia knew everything about what was going on. They were monitoring the whole situation. There are letters up and back between the embassies and the home country saying we should feign ignorance and disbelief as the Indonesian atrocities mount. As I mentioned, Australia was already, even before the invasion, involved in an arrangement with Indonesia to steal Timorese oil. As soon as the invasion took place, the United States increased military aid. It offered new counterinsurgency equipment to Jakarta. The U.S., in fact, was supplying 90% of the arms, and as we move into the Carter administration, the arms flow increased, as I mentioned, reaching its, again, renewed in 1978 as the slaughter hit its peak. Diplomatic aid was the same. We don't have to go to secret documents for this. Our ambassador is at the UN at the time was the well-known advocate of international law, constantly praised for his love of international law and defense of it, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And he was honest enough in his memoirs to write exactly what had happened. He was ambassador in December 1965. Here's what he said. He said, the United States wished things to turn out as they did and worked to bring this about. The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective in whatever measures it undertook against the Indonesian invasion. This task was given to me, and I carried it out with no inconsiderable success. And he knew exactly what the success was. Next sentence goes on to say, within the next few months, and then sort of went on. Well, that's not evidence, but try to find some discussion of what it means. Again, just kind of inadvertence, it was missed. Well, attention dropped to zero, but it picked up again later, particularly in 1990 and 91 in interesting ways. Two things in those years brought attention to East Timor. One was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which was so really hard to miss the parallels. They were dramatically obvious. And questions were raised by the media. Now, it wasn't a big problem in the United States, because no one respectable raised the questions, only, bad people around the margins. But in Australia, the questions were raised, and by the media, so they're reacting so differently to the two. And answers were given. The foreign minister, Gareth Evans, pointed out quite accurately, in his words, that there is no binding obligation not to recognize acquisition of territory by force. The world is an unfair place, littered with examples of acquisition by force. Therefore, it is quite legitimate for Australia to support and back Indonesia's conquering of East Timor, its taking over its oil with Australian help, and so on. After all, the world's an unfair place, littered with acquisition by force. Why should we behave differently? Prime Minister Bob Hawke had a somewhat different story at the same time. He said big countries cannot invade small neighbors and get away with it. Of course, he was talking about Iraq, Kuwait, not Indonesia, East Timor. And he went on to explain that the weak will feel more secure because they know that they will not stand alone. A nation rule of law must prevail over the rule of force in international relations, guided by the righteous Anglo-American. All of these are right in parallel, you know, and I should say in the Australian media were critical, though it had no effect anywhere else. In Britain in particular, British intellectuals were lecturing with quite impressive gravity about the values of their traditional culture as they stood up against the Iraqis in Kuwait. Meanwhile, British aerospace entered into new contracts with Indonesia, and in fact, Britain moved on to become the biggest arms supplier to Indonesia, replacing the United States in the early 1990s. It's one thing to, you know, I mean, it's, again, you know, there's worthy and unworthy victims. When you can make money out of mass murder and torture and aggression, that's fine. But when it interferes with your interests, as when Iraq moves into a traditional British protectorate, still, you know, sending its wealth to England, that's its function, that's quite different. Just coming in here, I was listening to BBC. There's a big scandal in England now because of Matrix Churchill, you know, this British company that was sending lathes to Iraq, which maybe were used for military purposes before Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, when incidentally Britain and the United States were quite supportive of Saddam Hussein. But now that's become a scandal, so everybody's all, you know, there was a discussion over BBC just now about how terrible it is and, you know, how our government's all upset. Of course, there's no question what happens when you send, say, Hawk, you know, when you send jet planes to Indonesia. I mean, they're not lathes which might be used for military purposes. They're being sent there to carry out, to implement aggression and terror right now. And there's no protest about that. In fact, the ability to compartmentalize is astonishing, but again, a technique you have to learn if you want to get ahead in the world. So there's another lesson you can look at. Well, that was one, and as I say, in 1989, Australia completed its treaty arrangements with Indonesia to take Timorese oil. In November 1991, a second problem arose which focused some attention on East Timor, namely the massacre in Dili, which you just heard about. At that time, the Indonesians made a tactical error. In case you're ever in power in any government, you want to remember that atrocities should not be carried out in front of television cameras. That's a well-known mistake. You're supposed to wait till the television cameras are pointing in some other direction. Then you can do whatever you feel like. But carrying out an atrocity in front of television cameras is terrible, and it requires fraudulent trials afterwards to show how wonderful you are because you're prosecuting the bad people and a lot of flurry and so on and so forth. And that was the error that the Indonesians made, and there were some consequences. One consequence was that several low-level Indonesian soldiers were given a couple of months in jail. No generals or anything like that. Another consequence was that people who had committed the crime of surviving Indonesian bullets, now quote from Noam Chomsky, a British correspondent, the people who had survived the crime of who had committed the crime of surviving Indonesian bullets got huge sentences, you know, up to life, in fact, 10, 15 years up to life, and they're still in jail. Demonstrators in Jakarta, afterwards, Timorese demonstrators in Jakarta also got up to 9 years in jail, and a lot of them are still in jail, incidentally, and one thing you can do if you want to do something, not just listen, is pressure Congress people and others to do something about the people who are in jail for having committed the crime of surviving Indonesian bullets. That was one thing that happened. A second thing that happened was that immediately after the Dili massacre, oil companies moved in, in December, the next month, new oil leases were given, dozens of oil leases to rob Timorese oil. It's interesting that nobody's noticed that. You know, it's again one of those inadvertent lapses. I mean, one imagines that if, say, Libya had made a deal with Iraq to exploit Kuwaiti oil, maybe somebody would have noticed, like could have been a small item in the back pages somewhere. But this one somehow passes unnoticed, because newsroom's a busy place, remember. Another consequence was that immediately after the massacre, new arms poured into Indonesia, mainly from Britain, and a different reaction took place in the United States, and a very heartening one. Popular organizations finally developed. The East Timor Action Committee developed. It was able to put considerable popular pressure on Congress. Other activists, particularly Arnold Cohen, who's been leading this for years, and a few others, had succeeded in getting a number of people in Congress, mostly conservatives, I should say, interested in the issue. Enough pressure built up, popular pressure and others, to get the U.S. government to end military training. That was important. In Boston, something interesting happened. Last year, an Indonesian general was forced to flee from Boston. One of the people who Indonesia sort of sent out, away from the spotlight after the Dili massacre, went to the Harvard Graduate School. That's one of the places where you send war criminals to get better trained. He also participated. While Harvard denied that he was there, some activists discovered him, and there's an interesting article in the Boston Globe with the headline, "Indonesian General Flees Boston." Just a year before, something similar had happened at the Kennedy School. There was another mass murderer there. A big mass murder, bigger than the Indonesian general. General Gramajo was one of the leading killers in Guatemala, who we supported in the early 80s. Again, I had heard that he was there. I read it in the Central American press, and I told some of the Central American activists who checked with Harvard, and they assured him he absolutely wasn't there, nothing to it. But Alan Nairn, who was in the Dili massacre, in fact, and reported it, and the Center for Constitutional Rights pursued it and discovered he indeed was there. And when he showed up to get his degree in graduation, they came with a subpoena, right in front, again, in front of the television cameras, charging him, bringing him to court, charging him with a civil suit that was, and he fled the country at that point, and therefore lost the civil suit, and now owes $10 million if he ever shows up again, but he'll probably be the next president because he's the State Department's man, so he'll get diplomatic immunity. Anyway, things can be done. There's now an amendment in Congress, the Feingold Amendment, which is being watered down in various ways, but its general impact would be to end American military aid to Indonesia, or at least limit it. That's significant. If things like this were going on in the United Kingdom and other places, it would add to the impact, but the impact's already considerable. Ben Anderson, who's one of the leading Indonesian scholars, pointed out recently, quoted, in fact, the Indonesian foreign minister as saying that, he said, Timor is like a piece of gravel in our shoe. It's hurting us, and maybe we ought to get rid of it. There's now some talk, according to Anderson, who knows this very well, there's talk in Indonesia about, maybe we ought to get rid of this, causing us too much trouble. Well, there are a lot of things we can do to make that piece of gravel sharper. I mean, it's not just a matter of, thinking about how awful the Indonesians are. There's plenty that we can do to maybe, in fact, end one of the world's major atrocity stories, maybe even to bring about self-determination for East Timor in less than 1,000 years. And perhaps, finally, we can even learn something significant about our own society and institutions, thus benefiting vast numbers of people throughout the world, including ourselves. Thanks.
Mr. Ramos Horta's plane has landed and he has arrived. He's going to say a few words briefly, and then we'll field questions for all three speakers. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Ramos Horta is the co-chairman of the National Council of Mau Bear Resistance. We learned just today that he will be receiving on behalf of the Timorese people a very prestigious award from the Thorolf Rafto Foundation in Norway. It's the Thorolf Rafto Prize for Human Rights. To give you an idea of how significant this is, the 1990 winner went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Please welcome the distinguished chairman of the National Council of Maoist Resistance, Mr. Jose Ramos Horta.
You having had the privilege of hearing my colleague Constancio Pinto and Chomsky, I believe you have had enough of information, enough of background into the Timor problem, the Timor struggle, so I shall spare you of dwelling too long into the same areas. My apologies for arriving only now. It was beyond my control. It is the weather and the famous American airline TWA. After 2 hours delay at the airport and stuck in the plane, I asked where I could leave because I knew I wouldn't make on time. They said, no, you cannot leave the plane. And I felt like being in a prison. So I arrived only 4 hours later after the scheduled time. So much for the on-time airline. And forgive me if I'm not too terribly fluent now after this traumatic experience at the airport and flying here. I will try mainly to concentrate on what are the prospects for a solution to the Timor problem. What is the peace proposal, peace plan of the Timorese resistance, and what is the role of the UN, and what the United States can do at this stage. Certainly 20 years after the invasion, to what today the Timor case is at the UN and internationally, has been a long road, has been a progress that we can feel just in the fact that we have been able to keep this issue alive, thanks to the effort of so many people, so many individuals around the world. When I first arrived in this country in 1975, I was then probably the youngest person ever to address the United Nations Security Council. I do not mention how old I was then, because I'm very sensitive about age issues. Today, I refuse to discuss age. But when I addressed the Security Council at the time in 1975, probably in New York City alone, there will be no more than half a dozen people who knew about East Timor, where it was in the map. And I remember going to my favorite Chinese restaurant in New York to eat, and the Chinese waiter, always curious where his client, his customers were from, and I said, I'm from East Timor. With his accent and with my accent, we misunderstood each other, and I said, I'm from East Timor, and he said, oh, you are an Eskimo. And when I insisted, no, it's not Eskimo, it's from East Timor, he said, you mean Istanbul? But today, I believe the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC television, CNN has given a bit more attention, space to East Timor, and I believe many more thousands, probably millions of people in this country are familiar with the issue. And that alone has been a major success for those human rights defenders, for those friends of ours in this country, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere, who have not given up over the years against overwhelming odds, the wall of silence, the curtain of silence that some media has tried to impose on us, which Professor Chomsky referred to. We believe that independence is around the corner. 20 years after the invasion, it is obvious, it's evident that Indonesia has not won the war in East Timor. It retains military superiority, it retains the initiative in the terrain, but it has not liquidated the guerrilla resistance. In fact, maybe in the next few weeks, major TV stations around the world might show some pictures, some images of the resistance itself in the mountains. When we talk about the war of resistance, we don't talk only about the guerrilla activities, but the resistance as a whole, which involves the armed resistance. It involves a cultural, political front, religious, clandestine front, and so on. And Indonesia lost the political battle. It retains its military superiority, it retains the military initiative, but it lost the political front, the political battle. And it is losing ground on the diplomatic front. It retains in the territory 13 battalions. This is the information that has been passed on to us by the current resistance leader, Mr. Connie Santana. These 13 battalions are engaged in massive operations throughout the country in the last few weeks, few months. In parallel, there has been a major crackdown on priests, on churches, on students, on civilians in general throughout the country. This in spite of the promises by the Indonesian Foreign Minister, Mr. Ali Alatas, in September 17 in New York, that Indonesia would initiate measures to improve the human rights situation in the territory. Almost 20 years later, what has Indonesia gained with its invasion of East Timor? I believe, like anyone with common sense, believe that it gained nothing. It brought misery, suffering, pain to the people of East Timor. It brought embarrassment, shame to itself. A country that today presides over the so-called non-aligned movement, at a time so crucial, so difficult for the Third World, when the Third World needs a credible leadership, need a country to lead it in this time of difficulties, in this time of North-South confrontation. Instead, it has a country, Indonesia, a military dictatorship that invaded East Timor, that perpetrates gross human rights violations in Indonesia itself, that has made the people of West Papua almost a minority in their own country, that is persecuted Muslims in Aceh, a country that talks often about Bosnia or about Middle East, about Palestine, criticizing Israel for the violation of human rights of Palestinian people. Yet, its forces, its troops, its government officials are guilty of genocide against the Muslims in Aceh. It is guilty, it is responsible on the crime of genocide against the people of East Timor, in East Timor, and the people of West Papua, in West Papua. This is the regime that is leading the non-aligned movement. This is the regime that is supposed to provide the non-aligned movement, the third world countries, the developing countries, with a leadership in these times of difficulties for the third world. And maybe Indonesia's leadership of the non-aligned movement raises serious questions about the morality, the issues of morality, of integrity, of leadership that face the entire third world countries. How could have the third world countries decided to nominate, to elect a dictatorship to lead the movement? When you elect a leader, you are responsible for his or her election. Third world countries in general are equally responsible for having elected a leader that is guilty of the crime of genocide against the people of East Timor, the people of West Papua, and the people of Aceh. Indonesia thought in the beginning of 1975 that within weeks, within a few months of its invasion, it would resolve the problem of East Timor. It did not. Today, the issue of East Timor is high on the agenda of the Secretary General of the UN, in spite of his overwhelming task, his other tasks that face him. It is high on the agenda of the US Congress, as Chomsky mentioned. It's high on the agenda of the European Community, of the Council of Europe. In March this year, the Commission of Human Rights, which is made up of 53 countries, adopted unanimously a resolution condemning Indonesia and calling on all the thematic rapporteurs to report on the situation in East Timor. Out of the 53 countries, only 12 voted with Indonesia. And I could name the 12 that voted with Indonesia, which are flowers of democracy. One is China, voted with Indonesia. The other was Bangladesh, Iran, Libya, Cuba, voted with Indonesia. Yes, strangely, Cuba. In the Commission of Human Rights, in the subcommission in Geneva, we find Cuba siding with countries like Iran, like Iraq, like Libya, like China, like Indonesia, to stop every draft resolution on human rights situations in the third world. But these were the countries, 12 countries, that sided with Indonesia on the resolution on East Timor in the Human Rights Commission in Geneva. 23 countries voted with East Timor, and not only the Western countries, quite a few African countries, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, which are members of the Commission, Brazil, Costa Rica, and several other African countries. On September 17 in New York, the Portuguese and Indonesian foreign ministers met under the auspice of the Secretary General Boutros Ghali to discuss the situation in East Timor. They addressed mainly the human rights issues, and Indonesia, the foreign minister of Indonesia, agreed to facilitate the access to East Timor by UN specialized agencies, human rights organizations, media, and so on. But they did not address the root of the issue. The root of the problem is Indonesia's occupation, is absence of an act of self-determination. Speaking at the European Parliament in Brussels in 1992, and also in the Council of Foreign Relations in May 1992, on behalf of the National Council of the Timorese Resistance, we put forward a comprehensive peace plan. This peace plan has 3 phases. Phase 1 contemplates improvement of the situation, human rights situation in East Timor, access by specialized agencies of the UN, greater access by the International Committee of Red Cross, the setting up of a local human rights commission headed by the local bishop, release of all political prisoners, and so on. In phase 1, we do not address the issue of self-determination or Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. The two sides, the Timorese and the Portuguese side, and the Indonesian side, maintain our respective positions, and that is, we continue to claim self-determination. Indonesia continues to view East Timor as its 27th province. However, we do not address these issues. We address the more pressing issues of human rights in East Timor. Is Indonesia prepared to cooperate with the UN and meet with us in addressing the pressing human rights issues in East Timor? This was the olive branch we proposed. Improvement of the human rights situation, establishment of a Commission of Human Rights in East Timor, headed by the Bishop, access to the territory of specialized agencies of the UN, non-governmental organizations, release of all prisoners, and then we move on to phase 2. Phase 2 would see local elections organized and supervised by the UN for the election of a territorial assembly. This territorial assembly would elect a local governor. This assembly would legislate on local affairs, on immigration, on land, on local economy, and so on. The territory would be able to enter into trade relations with other countries. Again, in phase 2, we still would not address the issue of Indonesian claim of sovereignty or our claim of self-determination. The territorial assembly would have a 5-year period. This means 2 + 5, 7 years. Indonesia would have 7 years to prove to the international community, but more importantly, to prove to the people of East Timor that it has changed, that it is now dealing with East Timor in good faith, that it acknowledges the past mistakes, that it is prepared to start anew, and maybe, in the course of 7 years, win the trust, the confidence of the people of East Timor. If the autonomy process, if the autonomy experiment works well in the course of its first term, 5 years, then maybe the Assembly would vote at the end of 5 years to recommend extension of the life of the Territorial Assembly. or Indonesia, at the end of the 7 years, would realize that an independent East Timor, after all, would not be a major problem for Indonesia, and would see an independent East Timor as a natural evolution, a natural outcome. We are providing Indonesia with the possibility of an honorable exit for East Timor, from East Timor. We understand Indonesia's sensitivities, we understand its national pride, we understand that a country, once embarking on a major military adventure, when a regime embarks on a major military adventure, might not be prepared to pull out and lose faith, and with the regime probably crumbling. Indonesia would not have anything to lose. It has only to gain if it accepts this peace plan that in fact is being followed by the advisors of the Secretary General, because there is no other alternative. When a few weeks ago I watched the Israeli-Palestinian discussions on autonomy, on self-rule, I was struck by similarity between the two peace plans. And I was struck by the picture of Yasser Arafat shaking hands with Israeli leaders. And you remember what they called each other the day before. Yasser Arafat was the greatest terrorist in the world, according to the Israelis and other Western media. The Palestinians retributed with the same adjectives bestowed on the Israelis. Yet they had the audacity, the courage, the vision to try peace in the Middle East. Why should not Indonesia have the same vision, the same courage, and acknowledge that the past 20 years have been wrong, have brought nothing to Indonesia, no benefit whatsoever, and on the other hand, enormous misery, suffering, pain to the people of East Timor. So we are proposing this peace plan in good faith, with open mind, that would enable Indonesia to disengage itself from the territory of East Timor. With the end of the Cold War, Indonesia lost the argument of that an independent East Timor would be another Cuba. So now they use another argument, that an independent East Timor would provoke the disintegration of Indonesia. They paint the pictures of Yugoslavization of Indonesia, Bosnianization of Indonesia. However, in our own understanding of Indonesia, of the movement that exists in Indonesia, we do not believe that there is any parallel between Indonesia and the ex-Soviet Union, there's any parallel between Indonesia and the ex-Yugoslavia. We do not believe that in the next 20, 30 years, Indonesia could disintegrate. And in any case, East Timor was never part of Indonesia. It was colonized by Portugal for almost 500 years, while Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch for almost 300 years. Indonesia never claimed East Timor as part of the so-called Dutch East Indies. What is Indonesia today was made up of the territories that constituted the so-called Dutch East Indies. It was for this reason that Indonesia claimed West Papua, West New Guinea, although the people of West New Guinea have a totally different history, culture, ethnicity, religion than the people of Java or other parts of Indonesia. And it's because of these very reasons that Indonesia claimed to be the successor state to the Dutch East Indies, that it did not claim the territory of East Timor. By invading East Timor in 1975, Indonesia breached a sacrosanct rule that has kept relative peace in Africa and has kept relative peace in Latin America and in Asia. And that is the inviolability of the colonial boundaries. Almost entire Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, were born out of the Berlin Conference. You imagine if every African country were to follow Indonesia's example and redraw the map that was imposed on Africa by the Berlin Conference. Somalia claimed northern Kenya, claimed Ogaden, as Ethiopia claimed Eritrea and fought a battle for 30 years to the cost of more than 1 million people. Venezuela claimed 2/3 of Guyana. Burkina Faso and Mali had a war a few years ago over border problems. It is Indonesia's invasion of East Timor, in fact, put in a big question mark to Indonesia's legitimacy or legitimate claims, historic and legal claims, to be the successor state to the so-called Dutch East Indies. Where is now the legal basis for the existence of the so-called Republic of Indonesia, when Indonesia itself violated the sanctity of the colonial boundary, when Indonesia itself destroyed the very legal argument that sustained its existence for the past 40 years as the successor state to the so-called Dutch East Indies. We are not claiming to secede from Indonesia because we were never part of Indonesia. We are not a separatist movement because we were never part of Indonesia. Indonesia invaded East Timor through a gross miscalculation. It thought that it could invade and resolve the problem within 2 to 3 weeks. It failed. Enormous cost to Indonesia and enormous cost to the people of East Timor. We appeal and we reiterate our good faith in negotiating with the Indonesian side without preconditions, under the auspices of the Secretary General of the UN, to find a suitable formula, a suitable arrangement that would permit Indonesia to disengage from East Timor without loss of face, gradually, in the course of the next 3, 5, 10 years. We are not intransigent in terms of time. We are intransigent in terms of principle, and our main principle is that ultimately the people of East Timor will have to make the choice through a referendum supervised by the UN. Indonesia claimed, and it might be right, that the people of East Timor are very happy as Indonesians. After thousands of years of being Timorese, of speaking Tetum, Irate, Galole, Habu, Makassai, and so on, Kemak, suddenly we are told the Timorese are Indonesians. Recently, I was in Bangkok and spoke with someone from the Thai Foreign Ministry. And I told the Thai official, when he said, it seemed that the people of East Timor were quite happy now as part of Indonesia. I asked him how he would think if Chiang Mai were to be invaded by the Burmese army and the next day declare everybody in northern Thailand to be good Burmese citizens, could no longer speak Thai, could no longer write Thai, all become Burmese citizens. This is what has happened to East Timor. This is what happened to Kuwait soon after Iraqi invasion. Kuwaitis were to become Iraqis. East Timor was East Timor for thousands of years, yet Indonesia say that overnight the people of East Timor now are good Indonesian citizens. We challenge it, we deny it, but maybe we do not possess the truth either. We make certain claims, Indonesia make other claims. How are we going to find the truth? Let's go to a referendum under UN supervision, so that the people of East Timor decide, one person, one vote, what they want for the future of the country. Independence, integration with the Republic of Indonesia, or free association with Portugal. Our peace plan provides a gradual exit, honorable exit for Indonesia to get out of East Timor. I reiterate, as we have done in the past several years, as we have done recently in talks with officials of the UN, we are prepared to meet the Indonesian side halfway. No preconditions, to discuss all possible ideas in order to bring about peace to East Timor. The limits to these ideas of what we will be able to discuss will be only imposed by the human mind. That's what the words of Xanana Gusmão, the resistance leader of East Timor. What can the United States do to finalize? I will not go into what the United States has done in the past 18 years. You heard a sober, comprehensive assessment, analysis of what was US policies, what has been in the past 20 years regarding East Timor. What could this current administration, the current US Congress, do? We would not ask the US to send another multinational force to East Timor. There are already too many multinational forces in too many places around the world. I don't know either whether we would want UN peacekeeping troops in East Timor. What we would ask the US to do is not to provide the Indonesian army, the Indonesian regime, with the weapons that kill the people of East Timor. What we would like to ask the US administration is to impose severe restrictions on the use of the existing weapons already in Indonesian hands. Because these are the American weapons that are killing the people of East Timor. Many of our own relatives were killed by American helicopters, Bronco aircraft, tanks, and so on, M16 machine guns. We would appeal to the compassion of President Clinton, the compassion of the US Congress, not to authorize the use of American weapons in East Timor. On a more practical level, we would like the US administration to more actively support the mandate of the Secretary General in trying to bring about a solution to the problem. Secretary Warren Christopher wrote a letter to the two foreign ministers of Portugal and Indonesia prior to the talks in New York on September 17. Maybe it was that letter that prompted the Indonesian foreign minister to be more promising in the talks in New York. We are grateful for that gesture on the part of Secretary of State Warren Christopher. However, we would like the US to impress upon the Secretary General, to impress upon the Indonesian side, that A, the Bishop of East Timor, the Catholic Church of East Timor, must be part and parcel of the entire peace process. The Bishop of East Timor must be brought into the negotiation process. Representatives of the resistance inside East Timor and outside East Timor must be brought to the discussion, to the negotiations. We are happy that finally, in the last few days, we were told that the Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, will be prepared to meet with representatives of the resistance. This is already a step forward in our own peace plan, which calls for indirect talks with the UN, while Indonesia does not accept face-to-face talks with us. We are prepared to find ways and means to convey our views to the Secretary General and to the Indonesian side through third parties. In this case, through the Secretary General of the UN, who has agreed to meet with us at a mutually convenient time in the future. What else can the US do to help bring about peace to East Timor? It can initiate action in the Commission of Human Rights in Geneva in the coming year, February next year.
Or the speakers entertain questions. Thank you.
Okay, for those of you that just heard Mr. Ramos Horta talk about what the United States can do to help the situation in East Timor, I have a little bit more specific information about what you can do to help the United States help the Timorese people. And let me just say that I'm talking from the experience of having been successful, the Rhode Island ETAN group plus the national group working together in getting legislation passed in the United States Congress to cut military training aid to Indonesia. And it turns out that it's really not that difficult a thing. I mean, it is difficult, but it can be done. And basically, your phone calls, I feel like I'm calling from a public TV here, but your phone calls really do make a very big difference. And all I can say is that all we did was make a lot of phone calls. We made several hundred phone calls, and we contacted people in Congress and let them know. And I'll tell you, I think one of the reasons that it's so effective is that most people haven't heard of East Timor, and when congressional aides hear somebody calling them about East Timor, they're really kind of surprised. And there aren't a lot of people out there calling them and saying, well, we want to send military aid to Indonesia. There are lobbyists doing that. As you may know, the military companies that support that build arms that are sold to Indonesia, those companies are lobbying very heavily against any cutoff in military aid. But individuals, by and large, people like yourselves are not. And so your phone call can be very helpful. Basically, the thing to do is just to call your senator. If you're an MIT student, call your home senator. If you're from this area, call Senators Kerry and Kennedy and just tell them what you want done, which is basically to cut military aid to Indonesia. There's a bill coming up possibly on Monday on the Feingold Amendment that Noam Chomsky talked about, maybe on the Senate floor on Monday. And if you can call your senator and tell them to support that amendment would cut all military aid to Indonesia. It would be historic. It would tie our military aid to human rights, and that would be an historic amendment. So here's the number. You can, if you have a pencil, 202-224-3121 is the number for the Capitol switchboard. And you can call and ask for your own senator, if you're from MIT, your home state senator, or for that matter, one of the senators from Massachusetts. Also, the address for ETAN is up on the board, and also in the back there's a sign-up sheet for the East Timor Action Network.
What's the number of the legislation?
The number of there's not a number. It's the Feingold Amendment to the Senate Foreign Aid Authorization Bill. So he's going to introduce this amendment. If all goes well, it has been, as Chomsky said, it has been watered down, but it's still better than nothing, and we need to really support that. Okay. 202-224-3121. It costs a few dollars. If you call after 5, there's still a lot of aides there. You can call after 5 to cut down on costs, and it really is worth it. It makes a very big difference. That's correct, and there's also the local offices here in Boston as well. Okay, thank you.
Isn't it, why would you want help from America, which totally fucked you up already? I mean, this is the people you're trying to get to, I suppose, right? Yeah. Okay. So I was just going to say that, I guess. And I wanted to ask Noam here a couple things, too. Sorry. Let's see. I wanted to know what you would have up-and-coming loner activists do in order to be motivated and try to not get burned out. What kind of things would you do? And also, would you have us do? And anyways, how did you persevere before you were even known? I mean, I would like to know that myself. Also, I mean, these are just weird questions maybe, but I'm an activist. I'm doing it alone. I don't have all these support PC groups or whatever to do what I believe in, and I'm trying to do what I can. I thought it was interesting, and I read it in the Thistle, about how only just like 3 or 4 journalists were the only keys for East Timor people to be heard internationally, and that's really strange. And in Iraq, you know, and as well as Grenada and many other things, our journalists have been, you know, stopped from reporting on those things. You know, and it just seems to me that there ought to be international types of things that are to get these words out. I mean, instead of just waiting for some kind of journalist, you know, in order to do it, maybe they'll feel like doing it or something like that.
They weren't stopped, they were self-censored.
Yeah, most of them are self-censored, right. I realize that. Yeah, and that's, you know, how do we deal with that kind of thing?
Rob,
okay. I don't know. I mean,
how about giving somebody...
I just took a lot of notes, and I just wanted to ask a lot of questions, and nobody else is up here much, so... What?
I mean, would that be enough to start?
Okay, I guess... Okay, yeah, that's a question.
Jose wants me to answer. Well, the first question, which was actually directed to Jose, is why the Timorese should ask for U.S. aid, considering what the United States has done to them, which is pretty ugly. I think the reason is pretty straightforward. They want to survive, you know. And the fact is, this is the world run by the United States. If the United States decides you're going to be crushed, you're going to be crushed. If the United States says you can survive, you can survive. Now, it's not that simple, but that's pretty close. You know, you want a close first approximation to the way the world works. That one's pretty close. What the United States does depends on what the people of the United States do. So if they do nothing, it will follow power, domestic power interests, which will quite naturally lead to support of Indonesia for all the reasons I mentioned and reasons which are quite obvious. Under popular pressures, the government can act in different ways. And, it's not a dictatorship. We're not going to get thrown into concentration camps. There are plenty of options. You can see this all the time. I mean, let's move to some totally different area, just to indicate how broad the thing is. In fact, it's everywhere. Take, say, the Kurds. The United States supported Saddam Hussein vigorously up until the day of his invasion of Kuwait. He was a good guy. So you lavished aid and affection on him. You wanted to gas Kurds, it's not our business, somebody else's business. We can make a lot of money out of it. In fact, if you look at the leaked documents, you find that James Baker and George Bush were celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall by sending messages to Congress saying we must increase aid to Iraq because it's good for American business and a lot of commercial profits and all sorts of other things like that. So they insisted on another $1 billion of loans so he could buy American goods. He did a bad thing. He disobeyed orders on August 2nd. Got to be knocked down. However, the United States has made it clear that they wanted an iron fist to rule Iraq, just like Iraq's iron fist. It's the word that was used. So when the Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north revolted afterwards, the U.S. backed Saddam Hussein. Now, there was no public protest over the slaughter of the Shiites, virtually none. So therefore that continued right under the eyes of Storm and Norman, wouldn't let Iraqi generals get, who were rebelling against Saddam, pick up captured equipment, and the Shiites were slaughtered. The Kurds, the reaction was a little bit different. Not for pretty reasons, for mostly racist reasons. If you remember the coverage at that time, there was all kind of coverage about these little children with, blue eyes and blonde hair, just like the ones at home, not dirty Arabs like the ones down in the south, who were getting slaughtered by this evil man. And that led to a lot of public protest. And the U.S. government was compelled, to provide a protection zone over northern Iraq in which the Kurds could survive. Well, the public protest subsided. Now there's no public protest. As a result, the protection is being lifted. The Kurds need money. They don't need a lot of protection. protection anymore. They just need some money, not a lot. They're asking for about $50 million from the international community, and they can't get it. Which means they've been traveling all over trying to lobby for it. Bill Clinton, I think, offered them about $5 billion. It was taken $1 million. It was taken away from some other program, so it doesn't cost anything. Well, okay, public pressure declines. The humanitarian gestures decline, but of course it goes the other way too. And what I think our Timorese friends are asking for is for the American people to put enough pressure so that the U.S. government will take a stand which will enable them to survive. That's perfectly reasonable and legitimate, no matter what the government would do on its own. As to what activists should do, and I'm going to give you a story about what I do, that's for another time, but the main point that you made, whoever asked the question, is how it pointed out, which I think is a very valuable point, is how hard it is to do it alone. In fact, it's virtually impossible, except for real crazy people. There are some people who've done things virtually alone. Even on this issue, I mentioned Arnold Cohen, who's been working on this for 20 years, almost alone, and has achieved an incredible amount. So it's conceivable, but hard. I mean, it's very hard to do things except together with other people. So, answer: you do things together with other people. You find groups of people, there are plenty, who are really concerned to do something, and you try to work with them. That's the way you do things alone. And that's also the answer to the last question. How do you can't wait, you're quite right, you can't wait for the press to, provide the information that you would want to hear. They have other interests and other commitments. It's a power system, after all. And that's why all sorts of alternative networks have developed. So, for example, take, say, email. I mean, more information about East Timor has appeared on email in the last couple of years than, appeared in all of preceding history. It's just flooding the networks, mostly because of groups like ETAN, which are putting on, material from Australia and the United Nations and all over the place. Well, not everybody has access to email, but if you have a group of people, you're very likely going to find somebody who has access to email and can then circulate that material. And in fact, in general, you create your own networks. That means alternative press, solidarity groups and their own organs, a lot of ways to do that. And ultimately, if that pressure builds up enough, the press will respond as well. So, for example, by now, the Boston Globe and the New York Times and the Washington Post are running quite good editorials on East Timor. And that's true in say, London as well, London Times and so on. It's not because they suddenly got religion, there's more pressure, and that changes things. And if there's any other answer, I don't know it. I mean, those are the answers.
Could someone say a word about Shana? Jusma? I'm not sure my pronunciation is very good, but I think I would be happy to have my own information refreshed and updated, and I'm sure there are people here who may not have heard of him. And what is his situation now that this trial, whatever, was I gather, completed?
Guzmão, the resistant leader of East Timor, was transferred to prison in Indonesia from Dili, East Timor, on August 12. He was first transferred to a prison for common criminals in Semarang, Central Java, but after a bit of international pressure, including from the International Committee of Red Cross, he was transferred to a political prison in Jakarta, well-known prison called Sipinan. That's where he has been for a few weeks now. On September 23rd, he was visited by representatives of the International Committee of Red Cross. His health seemed to be fine. He remains very firm on the issue of self-determination and independence of East Timor. For those who do not know the background, he was the resistant leader of East Timor for many years, well respected, widely respected throughout the country, in East Timor and overseas. Recently, he was nominated for the Sakharov Prize of the European Parliament. He probably will get it because there is a majority support in the European Parliament for that. He is a poet, he is a journalist, an intellectual with an incredible grasp of international affairs, even though he has been in the island, in East Timor, without contact with the outside world, physical contact, for almost 20 years. He was captured in November 1992 in a raid into a safe house where he was staying in Dili, the capital. He was subjected to psychological, physical torture for hours on end, and then there was a kangaroo court was set up in East Timor, which judged him between February till May this year. In May, at the last day of the charade, Xanana Gusmão was going to read his own defense plea. And the Indonesian presiding judge stopped him after only 2 pages, saying that what he was reading was irrelevant, was a political statement. That after several months of more than 200 pages of charges against the defendant, and then where the defendant wanted to say his version, his views on the whole situation, he was prevented from defending himself. The Indonesian judicial system is not known, was never known for independence, for integrity. Most Indonesian judges are crooks, are corrupt, as is the entire legal system in Indonesia. Yet, there was never a case that we know of where a presiding judge would stop a defendant from reading his or her own defense plea. Xanana Gusmão was denied even this most basic right. However, to the surprise of the Indonesian authorities, his defense plea was out of the country well in advance. And the day when he was denied the opportunity to read his own defense plea in a press conference in New York at the UN headquarters, I released his defense plea. That was a major surprise, shock to the Indonesian authorities, but later it transpired that it was, I don't know how it got to my hands. It came to my hands a few days before. Later it was the Indonesian media accused the UN Special Envoy, the Kenyan Attorney General, Mr. Amos Paku, who had been to Timor and had visited Mr. Xanana Gusmão in prison, who had smuggled out his defense plea. That's true or not, I don't know. And how the defense plea came into our hands, also, I don't know. The fact is that it was a major embarrassment for the Indonesian side. Xanana Gusmão remains a hero for the people of East Timor. He remains strong, firm. He is the Nelson Mandela of the people of East Timor. He is, for years, he prepared other leaders who are now in the country, in East Timor, Connie Santana, and many others of the younger generation who are in their 20s, in their 30s, who are continuing the struggle right now in the mountains or in the occupied areas. We believe that sooner than later, Xanana will be released in order to take part in the peace talks. Like Nelson Mandela walked out of the prison almost 30 years later to take part in the democratic process, in the transition process in South Africa. Xanana is indispensable, and we hope that common sense, intelligence, wisdom will prevail in Indonesia and release Xanana so that with his moral authority, with his credibility, popularity in East Timor, he will take part in the peace talks and prevail upon the people of East Timor when independence comes, to extend a hand of friendship, of reconciliation to the Indonesian people, because there are many Indonesian people already living in East Timor. One point I failed to make was that now there are more than 100,000 Indonesians living in East Timor. Most of them are poor peasants, poor workers. And many questions are asked to us, what would we do with the Indonesian peasants in East Timor? Our answer, all of us, is that we would extend a hand of friendship, of reconciliation to these people. They will be welcome to stay on in East Timor, and with us build a better home, a bigger home for all of us.
First is Constantino mentioned the fact that the rise of in the East Timor might be a factor in what's happening over there. FAIR in New York and Pacifica Radio mentioned the fact that as soon as the United States forces got to Somalia, they started pushing out propaganda trying to crush Islam. And several people from over there have mentioned in the news that that might be a factor as to why the United States continues to be in Somalia. So what I'd like to know is, are we seeing the beginning of a new crusade? Is this the Christians trying to destroy the Islamic people again? That's one. The second question is, as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union, there is no more aid to Cuba. And Cuba used to give aid in military and psychological support to independent movements around the world. Two I can think of right now are Angola and Nicaragua. Now, saying that Cuba is the cavalry, they're gone now. So who's going to be there to try and defend places like East Timor or other countries against the United States?
Well, I think the answer to the second question is like us. That's what it always was, ultimately, and that's what it's got to continue to be. I mean, it's true that the existence of other power centers in the world, whatever you think of them, offered some kind of space for independence and non-alignment, but that's pretty much gone. But the fact is, all the way through, no third world movement ever had a chance unless there was some support for it in the United States, significant support, enough to retard American power acting against it. And now that's even more important than ever. So the responsibility is greater than ever, and it's it's an enormous one, and there is nothing else. On the first question, I don't think the United States cares one way or another about Islam. What U.S. planners care about is independence. The U.S. just fought a war in Central America, huge war in Central America with a couple 100,000 people slaughtered, and it was largely a war against the Catholic Church, not against Islam. Reason, sectors of the Catholic Church, especially the Latin American bishops, had called for what they called the preferential option for the poor, for devoting church resources to organizing and helping poor people. Okay, that's a call to arms for the United States. As soon as you hear that, you go in and force and stop that heresy. Didn't matter that it was it was being carried out by priests. So like one of my close friends in Nicaragua who died a year or two ago was the Jesuit provincial for Central America, top Jesuit official in Central America, who was Guatemalan actually. He was driven out of Guatemalan because the Guatemalan generals, our guys, said they were going to kill all the Jesuits, so they all had to flee, and he went to El Salvador, where he was very close to Archbishop Romero. In fact, he was sort of his intellectual, basically. And when Archbishop Romero was murdered, he had to flee El Salvador, and he went to Nicaragua, which was a haven for, that's why we call Nicaragua a den of international terrorism, meaning it was a haven for people who fled from the Nazi-style states that we were running around Central America, and they fled to Nicaragua. It's kind of like the way the Nazis looked at Paris during, the fascists looked at Paris before they conquered it, a den of international terrorists, all kind of people fleeing from fascism. Okay, well, that was a war against the church. As far as Islam is concerned, the closest U.S. ally, closest U.S. ally in the Middle East happens to, next to Israel, happens to be the most fundamentalist Islamic state in the world. The most the most extreme fundamentalist state in the world, Saudi Arabia. They don't come more than that. That's our biggest ally. If you go to non-state movements, the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist element anywhere, as far as I know, was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group in Afghanistan. He just got $6 billion of aid from the United States, and Saudi Arabia, because he was on our side. I mean, a big narco trafficker and a murderer, an Islamic fundamentalist fanatic, and so on. But fine, he was quite okay. Problem is, he started shooting his guns in the wrong direction, and he became a bad guy. CIA training apparently was used to put the bombs in the wrong places, so they're bad guys. But it's not because they're Islamic fundamentalists or because they're Islamic, it's because they're independent. And you can be an independent, Catholic priest or Protestant clergyman or, Zoroastrian or whatever you may be. If you're independent, you're going to be bad. You can be a secular, a democratic, capitalist, democratic capitalist, like the leaders of Guatemala, but if you try to pursue an independent path, you're going to go. It's independence that's the problem. I mean, it may turn out, that it's going to turn out, because of the way our policies work, that an Islamic fundamentalist movement is going to sweep through much of the Islamic world. And the reason is we've essentially destroyed secular nationalism. Well, once you destroy secular nationalism, what's left? People are going to identify themselves somehow, I mean, this happened in the black community in the United States. People are going to identify themselves somehow. You're not just going to give up, Well, one of the ways out is to identify yourself with what's called fundamentalism. And in fact, if you look at places like, say, Egypt, where I was not long ago, almost the only people you meet among, say, relatively educated sectors, guys like us, who are even thinking about the problems of Egypt are the people who call themselves Islamic intellectuals. I mean, you can like what they say or not, but at least they're thinking about the problems of Egypt. They're not talking about deconstructionism or something or other. I'm not joking, incidentally. That has its effects. I mean, these are also people who have links to, things like the self-help groups that the Catholic Church developed in Central America. So like clinics, medical clinics and cooperatives and people who work in the slums and so on and so forth. You can tell who's going to win in that competition. It's going to be people associated with the Islamic movement. I mean, the Egyptian government can, put them down by force, and it can scream about how Iran is behind them and so on. But the fact of the matter is, what's behind them is the corruption and brutality of the Egyptian government, and the fact that secular nationalist alternatives have been destroyed, mostly by us and the British. And what's left is this. And I think that's going to happen throughout the region. So it may well end up the way you describe, with a U.S. war against Islam, but for reasons that have to do with other things. It just as there's been a war of the United States against Catholic Church in Central America.
Thank you.
Hello. I would like to ask another question to Professor Chomsky. How I feel about what it could be the peace process.
East Timor if the things that the last speaker told us will become true. So I think it's hard for me to believe that the U.S. will support real independence of East Timor. So I believe that if the U.S. starts to support East Timor's independence, it will be sure that the Indonesians' collaborator remain in power. It will install a formal democracy like the one in El Salvador, and it will keep the control of the resources of the country. So something like the Israel-Arafat agreement that you described, some kind of this. And of course, all of this will look very nice on the press, because the U.S. will be very benevolent, and the U.S. help to the Indonesian invasion will be obscured, just as it has been the case with the U.S. aid to Siad Barre, the Somali dictator.
Well, that's exactly what if the people of the West, in particular of the United States, say stay quiet. It'll happen in the Middle East, it'll happen in East Timor, it'll happen everywhere else. Yes, if people stay quiet, domestic power centers, which aren't all that different in the various Western countries, I mean, they're very closely linked. The United States is by far the most powerful, but they have, see things the same way with regard to the third world. They will pursue their interests, which will lead in exactly the direction that you described. But of course, it is not a law of nature that populations have to be quiet. They have already become agitated enough in the United States so that various steps have been taken, which I wouldn't have dreamt were possible years ago. Now, that hasn't happened in England, hasn't happened in France, hasn't happened in Germany, hasn't even happened in Sweden. So therefore, things go on, But it can change. And the same is true with regard to the Middle East. I mean, I'm much less optimistic than Jose about the Middle East peace process. In fact, I see it more or less the way you do. But that could change too. One of the reasons why it will, as things now go, in my opinion, end with something like complete capitulation of the Palestinians, is because there has never been a solidarity movement with Palestinians in the United States. There are a lot of reasons for that, including the incompetence and corruption of the PLO. But there are a lot of reasons for it. Until that happens, unless there's a support group in the United States that says, okay, Palestinians are people with rights, well, sure, they'll be crushed. That's the same for everyone else. In fact, it's the same for our third world at home, which is a huge part of a huge and growing part of the population. I mean, they'll be crushed too, unless people with privilege, do something to, enter into solidarity with them. It's extremely hard for people at the wrong end of the guns to survive unless they've got some support within, things near the power center. I mean, it can happen, but like slave revolts sometimes succeed, but it's very brutal.
We have time for just 2 more questions.
It seems to me the U.S. has no particular vested interest in keeping East Timor from gaining independence, because Indonesia, a state, does not preclude East Timor's independence as long as East Timor is willing to fit into the appropriate scheme. So it seems to me that there is some hope that the United States would not suppress the movement, and that if people are active enough, we could be effective, because why not?
The United States basically has no big stake in the matter. When we speak of the United States, we're talking about domestic power centers in the United States. Okay, now, leave them alone and they'll support Indonesia. That's the natural thing to do. But they have no big stake in it, you're exactly right. And makes it one of the easier cases to deal with in some respects. In fact, this East Timor protest group is a pretty remarkable affair. I mean, what's happened is that, I think I can virtually name every person who's been involved over the last 15 years. It's like half a dozen people, have succeeded in getting something which was able to terminate military training and may terminate military aid, which sent a real shock. It's not that they're going to have any problem getting guns. The British will be happy to supply them. But it's symbolically very important. And, that achievement on the part of a handful of people is incredible. It really shows what you can do when you work hard on it. And you can really name those people. I mean, I've done it sometimes in print. A couple of years ago, there were half a dozen of them.
Question for Professor Chomsky. In the spirit of your speech tonight, namely you shouldn't concentrate too narrowly on one place. Will you share with us your thoughts?
Recent event in Russia, namely, should Parliament be cracked down, and should U.S. support Iraq's cracked off democratically elected Parliament?
The United States wants in Russia has been clear for, in fact, approximately 70 years. Russia was part of the Third World. It was a deeply impoverished part of the Third World back in 1913, and in fact Eastern Europe was sinking relative to Western Europe, and had been for about 5 centuries. The split between Eastern and Western Europe goes back to pre-Columbian times. No part of the Third World is allowed to become independent. They have a role to play, a service role. They are to supply resources, raw materials, cheap labor, the usual run of stuff. The East Europe pulled out of that. Well, in a way, that's like Grenada running a fishing cooperative. There's going to be the 10th anniversary of our liberation of Grenada will take place in about a week over at Brandeis. You look back what happened. I mean, they started with little fishing cooperatives and a couple other things. I mean, Grenada's contribution to the world economy was influence on the nutmeg trade, but that was enough for the U.S. to move in and crush it. Okay, Grenada you sort of get rid of in a weekend. The Soviet Union maybe takes 70 years, but the logic is approximately the same. Now what the U.S. wants is what it wants for the rest of the Third World. Drive them into a Third World pattern. So force on them the same IMF. They're not doing it. The IMF is not as harsh with regard to Eastern Europe as it is with regard to Nicaragua. But remember, which I mentioned, the U.S. has a special reason for destroying Nicaragua, which they don't have in the case of Russia. They'd like to build them up as a place where Western European corporations can send their, production lines to crush Western European workers the way we use Mexico and that sort of thing. In fact, GM is investing there for the same reason. So that's what we want in Eastern Europe. And we'll support anybody who does it. Boris Yeltsin is called a Democrat for one simple reason. He supports IMF reforms. I mean, he'll be a Democrat even if he reinstitutes the Gulag, as long as he supports IMF reforms. On the other hand, if someone else comes along and says, look, actually what the parliament, whatever you think about these guys, what the parliament was in fact calling for was pretty much what the people of Poland voted for in the last election, namely slow down these free market reforms, which of course are devastating the country, as they will to any country. They would devastate the United States if we ever submitted ourselves to market discipline, which is why the U.S. never has, nor has any successful country. But third world countries are supposed to do it because in fact it does drive them to the approved third world model. Boris Yeltsin was willing to, and the parliament said, let's slow it down. So therefore he was a Democrat. And that'll, you know, if he is too brutal, there'll be some clucking of tongues, and, you know, you got to crack an egg in order to scramble it and that kind of business. A line taken from Stalin, which is used constantly in the West. Sure, but basically what it comes down to is whether he's going to submit to Western demands as imposed by the great powers, primarily the United States, and implemented by the institutions of the transnational corporations, namely the World Bank and the IMF. I wouldn't ask the question what the U.S. government should do, but the question is what we should do. And I think we should take the same attitude we take with regard to the rest of the third world, including by now our domestic third world, namely try to struggle for policies which will allow them to liberate themselves in their own ways. You know.
What he thinks of our continued presence in Somalia and what he predicts for the upcoming future of Haiti. In Haiti.
Well, you know, in Somalia, I mean, the U.S. moved in for completely self-serving reasons back last December. It had nothing to do with any problems in Somalia. It had to do, actually, Colin Powell, in a moment of candor, put it pretty accurately. He said that the intervention was a great public relations show for the Pentagon, which I think is sort of the point. The Somalis were kind of props. You know, the people of Somalia were props for PR. So the idea is they're supposed to stand there and starve while a Marine colonel gives them a jelly bean or something like that, and that looks good on TV. It was perfectly obvious at the time what was going to happen. You know, you send in a military force, pretty soon there'll be a war with the population. Okay, I mean, I'm not saying it in retrospect. I had an article in Z magazine about it right after the intervention. And it was obvious. You know, what do you do now? Well, you know, by now the options are narrowed. I mean, at the time, the thing to do was to try to work with emerging political forces in Somalia, of which there were plenty. I mean, there were popular organizations, there were, you know, the clan communities were reconstituting, there were women's groups, there were all sorts of things. Out of those, you know, they would have developed their own political system. In fact, in areas where the intervention did not take place, that's happening. Northern Somalia, there was no military intervention, and in fact, that's happening. It's not a pretty place, you know, but it's not South Mogadishu. That could have been done then. There was a political space that maybe, you know, it's hard to imagine, but maybe the intervention forces could not have disrupted it too much. Actually, the UN had a very successful negotiator there before the intervention, Mahmoud Sahnoun, as an Algerian, I think, who was very successful in bringing the various political groups together. Incidentally, the famine was almost over by the time the U.S. forces moved in, so that, you know, they may have what effect they had is uncertain. But Muhammad, because the newsroom is a busy place, I've read lots and lots of this commentary on this in the U.S. media, and I have yet to find one person who says there's something systematic that happened here. It's taken for granted that what happened was just, well, you know, things of that kind. And so that's not true media coverage abroad of how the U.S. media handled this thing. They're quite willing to say U.S. media are terrible, but that's because it's the U.S. media. When you ask about their media, then the same set of responses comes along. Again, a narrow focus has many merits. I don't want to discredit it. It means that we can avoid the discovery of the fact that the policies that the U.S. government follows and the planning that lies behind them is highly systematic. U.S. is a global power, therefore we find very much the same policies, same things guiding them all over the world. We find that human rights are not violated just in East Timor, but that U.S. aid correlates very closely with torture, for example. It's been demonstrated over and over again. We find that the doctrinal institutions, not just the media, but the intellectual culture generally, focus on what my co-author Edward Herman has sometimes called worthy victims, namely those whose suffering is utilitarian for career and power interests. That is, you can exploit their suffering to support domestic power and hence advance your own interests. They're worthy victims because some enemy is doing something to them, and if it's not bad enough, you can make up stories. On the other hand, you keep away from unworthy victims, those who are being tortured or slaughtered either by us or by our agents, since plainly no career or power interest is served by focusing attention on unworthy victims. You don't do it. Note that that's exactly the opposite of the behavior of any person of minimal moral integrity, but it is entirely systematic. In fact, it's a feature, almost a defining feature of the intellectual culture, not just the media. This is not a new discovery, I should say. About 150 years ago, when the system of compulsory education was being introduced in an effort to convert independence, the most efficient is to focus very narrowly, in time and in place. So you take a look at one case or some narrow time frame, and you look at that. And as long as you look at some narrow time frame, whatever you discover, how awful it is, it basically teaches you nothing, because it could be by accident or inadvertence or oversight or whatever. Lots of excuses. So, for example, right now there's a big discussion going on, as you're all aware, as to how we should design a post-Cold War foreign policy. What are the guidelines? So and the framing of the discussion is, how can we enlarge our commitment to market democracy, and how can we learn better how to carry out humanitarian intervention? The discussion keeps very strictly to the post-Cold War period. In fact, if you look, it keeps very strictly to the last few weeks, usually. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you keep it focused very narrowly, then it's unnecessary to ask the obvious question that would occur to a rational person, and that is what our record has been with regard to markets and democracy and human rights. And that's a useful move, since if you face those questions, the discussion about enlarging our commitment to market democracy or learning better how to carry out humanitarian intervention can't even be raised. And you furthermore learn that the reasons for this have absolutely nothing to do with the Cold War. And exactly the same is true with regard to place. So tonight we're meeting on East Timor, and tomorrow it might be on Somalia, and the next day on the Israel-Arafat Accord, and then on Haiti. And we have specialists who study particular regions out there and tell us all about them. And they're the ones that you go to if there's a problem somewhere. The problems that are all externalized. There are things that happen in that strange world out there that we somehow are caught up in against our will and don't quite understand them and so on. And we therefore carry out policies out of ignorance or inadvertence. The media don't report it very accurately. Like, for example, they didn't report the US-backed atrocities in East Timor because of carelessness or oversight.